All right, so I'm going to get much more speculative. You may think I've been speculative enough throughout the semester, but now that we come to the end, I want to take a chance to look a little bit more at the bigger picture, the longue durée, the longer period of history that's laying itself out in front of us, and talk about some of the possibilities there. I mean, 5 years out, it's pretty easy to guess what the technological world's going to look like because what's in labs today is likely to trickle out to early adopters in 5 years and to the broad, for the technologies that are successful, to the broad population in about 10 years. So, things like quantum computing, which exists mostly in the lab right now. There are actually production quantum computers that are available, but mostly it's in the lab, or is probably going to become more widely available and then eventually make its way into consumer devices. So we can kind of guess out some of this stuff. And once you have the technological piece is easier to guess over the next 5 to 10 years than the social or the political or the cultural. But you can at least get an idea of where we're going to be, and you can start to make some projections about how that might be affected by and affect these various spheres of social interaction. Once you get to 20 years, you're really just shooting from the hip. It's really hard to get a really good idea of whether AI and deep learning are going to take over half the jobs and things like that. The 20-year window, 15 to 20-year window is really difficult to get your hands around. Once you move to the 30 and 40-year range, it used to be 50 and 60, but things have sped up to the degree where if you ask me where we're going to be in 30 or 40 years, and most of you, probably I won't be alive, but most of you will be alive in that period, it is very difficult for me to say what human society will look like at that point. Some things are conservative, some things stick around, some things seem to stay longer than people expect. But it seems like the technological changes happening so quickly that it will be difficult for the social and the cultural and the political not to change drastically over that same period of time. So let's talk about some of those possible pathways. One is Morvik's idea of a singularity, and you hear this tossed around a bit. And the thumbnail sketch of this is robots and AI especially are advancing at such a rate. There's other pieces too. There's an argument in there that people born today won't die, which is an interesting one, right? That we seem to be throwing enough resources at life extension that that we've gone from when I was born for a man something like 68 years old up to 72 or 73, I think. I don't know what the numbers are. You guys can fact check me on that. But even in the period of my lifetime, the average life expectancy, even in the US, has extended significantly. And if we can tackle some of these big ones, cancer, heart disease, some of these pieces, then we'll see some significant life extension to the 140-year range as being something that's easily achievable. Then easily achievable, I say that as if I have a magic switch, but that is at least conceptually not that difficult to reach. And then from there, replacement parts and all the rest of it means that we can basically live forever. So, it's possible that some of the wealthiest kids born today will never die. Which is a bizarre thought. But leaving that aside, technologies of artificial intelligence and robotics, Morvik and others argue, have been approaching humans quicker and quicker. And it's not like they're going to stop when they hit human intelligence, right? If AI is evolving, we could say, at a rate that humans never could have. And so if they do evolve from being pretty stupid today to being equivalent to human intelligence in 15 years, then in another 5 or 10 years, they will have far surpassed our abilities, or if it's on a linear scale, which is another question. But the argument is they will have far surpassed humans. And so humans, if we're lucky, the AIs will keep us as pets, right? So there's that version, which is kind of the end of human history. And not necessarily in a bad way. Maybe we just become very, very different, so different from our current humans that we don't recognize the past humans. So that's one. I don't know if it's utopian or dystopian. It's hard to, I guess it depends on which side you sit on there. But one potential outcome, which is that we innovate ourselves out of existence. And then the opposite, which I don't know that it's the opposite, is that we do just the opposite, which is somewhere along the line we screw things up really badly. So we create autonomous war systems that end up killing us, for example. Or right now I can go and buy a CRISPR kit and on Amazon and design my own designer bacterium sometime this weekend. So, maybe we start to have designer diseases that end up killing us. Or gray goo and nanotech isn't as sexy as it used to be, but there was this idea that once you had nano level self-assembling machines, one of them would have an error in their code and basically would build itself until we were covered in gray goo and die. Like the planet would cover itself in gray goo. I think that one's the least possible out of these, but some of these are much more possible. Even if you don't think that people are going to design a designer virus or chemical weapon, honestly, nuclear is within reach to a much greater extent than it was when people worried about it in the 70s and 80s. It's not just terrorists, it's just weird people who might decide to build their own nuclear device. So we will have an individual terrorist, I think by the time you detonate a nuclear device, you are by definition a terrorist, but some individual who creates their own nuclear weapon within the next 15 to 20 years. I can't imagine, we probably already have, and we just don't, there are people that are close, we do know some cases of people who've done nuclear reactors, but I don't know of anyone who's done a nuclear weapon, but they wouldn't want you to know, the man wouldn't want you to know if that had happened. So I suspect that we will have a nuclear incident within the next 20 years. That doesn't have to be a human ending accident, but the question is how we will respond to that. Once that barrier has been broken and we know that anyone can develop a nuclear weapon, how are we going to respond to that? And that will be an interesting kind of thing to deal with politically, culturally, socially. Will we really move into a space where surveillance is a matter of survival? So maybe something like a tech-borne apocalypse. It's not beyond the realm of possibility. I think it is much more likely in some ways than this idea of the singularity. I think the singularity is probably, in math, what we would call a limit. I think we continue to approach it and that we get closer and closer in some ways, but there are pieces that are still going to be very substantial barriers to artificial intelligence that would count as intelligence by our own hand. I'll talk about that in a second. I think the most likely outcome is somewhere in the middle, and it might actually be dead in the middle. Some very bright people think that technology is self-correcting in terms of its social change. So I think that there was this period during the blogosphere when people were starting to write on their own and create their own spaces, where there was a significant amount of revolutionary potential in the internet and internet technologies. I think Facebook, much more than Google, I think Facebook has made us stupid. I think these platforms that are for self-expression alone are making us dumb. I think that the move from textual to visual in terms of our social media, that is the move from even Facebook, and Twitter, which were already dumb, to Instagram and to Snapchat, is making us dumb. It's making us not just stupid, but also socially incapable of making important change. Now, that's okay. We've had periods like that before. It may just be that we're at the very tail end of a huge jump forward in the way that technology works with society. I mean, it's really hard to overestimate the ways in which we've changed in the last 20 years. So maybe we've spent that out. There's evidence of this kind of on the tech side. I don't need a new laptop. I'm not going to need a new laptop for a while because things are not the things you can do with your computer are not advancing quickly enough. Now maybe some of that's because it's moving to the cloud, but basically, where are the giant breakthroughs in software? We haven't seen them really, right? There are places around AR and some other places where it's like, oh, that's kind of cool, but we don't have that jaw-dropping tech that we used to have. And so maybe we've spent it on the tech side. On the social side, maybe we're hitting, and on the political side, we've seen a snapback, right? We've seen a new conservatism, not just in the US, but around the world, some of it being kind of extreme, the extreme right-wing conservatism, moving towards being afraid of immigrants, being afraid of moving towards fascist systems. And so this looks a lot like, just before World War II. The economic system looks like it was just before 1929, an extreme division between the rich and poor in most developed countries. Less so in places like Germany, of course, and Scandinavia, but in much of the world, that division is widening, particularly in the United States. So we may be in a position, not just in a period of stasis, but a lot of these social pieces might put the brakes on any significant social change. If you had asked anyone around 1890 to 1920 what the United States would look like in 1950, 60, and 70, almost everyone would have said that we would have approached something closer to socialism. The idea that we would still have a structure that looks like it does now, and a capitalist structure like we have now, would have been a shock to anybody, because it really looked like everything was moving in that direction. And certainly in the recovery from the Great Depression, there were elements that looked a lot like socialism, that were basically a liberal version of socialism. But we never really went where people had expected. People thought that a combination of technology and the demands of capitalist structures would lead to socialism in the fairly short term, and they were wrong on that. And part of that was the Great Depression, although that actually helped things along the line a little bit, but certainly World War II. So it may be that we are hitting this period if you look at the news, you think we're in a period of extreme danger, etc. That's not true. We've had the longest period of peace in terms of people dying in wars, even with things like Syria and extreme levels of death. It's still been at a global level, a relatively peaceful stretch for the last several decades. And it's also been a relatively prosperous stretch. Although the middle class in the United States has been stable for about 40 years. That is, they haven't really seen a rise in incomes, maybe in lifestyle, but it's hard to measure that. Globally, there's no question of this, that global rates of starvation and poverty have been reduced substantially over the last several decades. So we've been at a fairly peaceful clip here, and the question is whether conservative motions against that kind of progress will result in large-scale wars, especially, but also movements towards fascism. And there's no question that the right wing in Europe and in the U.S. has been a push towards fascist approaches to understanding the nation, for example, or anti-globalist movements against sort of interaction and migration and things like that. So it feels like we've had a snapback. And it may be that some of that is just the nature of progress. We've been making so many changes in the way society works and the way people think about each other over the last 20 or 30 years. It may just be that there's going to be a heavy set of breaks by people who feel like this has been too much, too fast. I think that's of the most, if you look at that compared to the more extreme versions of everything continuing to accelerate, I suspect that's much more common, much more likely rather. If I had to make a bet, though, I am naturally an optimist. I think that we will continue to see rapid human change. I think that we will merge much more quickly than we have in the past with machines. I don't think it's a question of AI sort of taking over, but rather how humans become more like AI, or how we integrate artificial intelligence into what it means to be a human. I think that is actually going to continue apace. It may be that continues apace in some small spaces, while the larger spaces become more resistant to these technologies. I don't know if that's the case, but that's a possibility. So that's one outcome, and I think a pretty likely outcome. I also think we're going to continue to see a rapid change in our physical and planetary environment, and that to a certain extent. So on the one hand, I don't think we're going to see many people think that there's a technological fix to global climate change. That seems very unlikely to me. I don't think we can halt the rapid change in climate. And we live in Phoenix, so I think we're going to see continued. Right now I think we hold the record for global high temperature in a city, and I think we're going to keep resetting that record over the next few years. The ice caps are melting at a rate that nobody anticipated, 3 times what the middle prediction rate was. So we don't stop that. There isn't a tech fix to that. We can slow it maybe, but we don't stop it. That said, I do think we may be moving towards something close to the Philosopher's Stone. No, it's not a maker bot, right? So on the one hand, people are going to start making their own stuff to a much greater extent. They're going to see local production, local use. That can't be for everything. Some materials production has to be at scale. But I think we're going to see a lot more at the edges that are people doing home fabrication of one kind or another. And I think we'll start to see that moving to the nanoscale to a greater extent. So I think we'll start to see people producing things that we didn't think could be produced before by both genetic engineering and by materials engineering at a very, very small scale. So I do think we're going to start to see that having a shift and maybe even a movement towards, again, at the periphery. I don't think large-scale capitalism is going anywhere in the short run, but I think that we're going to start to see communities and spaces that become much more focused on creative making and much less focused on the traditional 9 to 5. And the 9 to 5 is gone. I mean, this is the German example of a 25-hour work week seems likely within industrial countries. Part of that is because when Germans go to work, they just work. They don't check Facebook. They don't call home. They don't write their resume for the next job. They're just working. So that's one pathway. And I think that's going to be more common across the world in countries that manage to remain part of the kind of first world. I think that within certain circles that will be ditched and people will no longer have a work week. And I think that is already happening, and I think it will continue to happen within certain circles. But I don't think we're going to have the sort of mass change anytime soon. And that may be problematic because some people are going to still have to work while a large portion of the society is moving. I mean, obviously the very wealthy in the United States have not had to work for centuries now. But that group may grow, and we may have people that are kind of what now call themselves the upper middle class who don't have to work, who engage in a different kind of consumption, who move away from consumer society, and who have enough resources to be able to live without having to work. And so I think that will create some significant new political questions and changes. How do you tax people who don't have incomes in the traditional sense, or who have intentionally reduced their incomes because they're not working in wage labor? So what do you do with that? And I think that will introduce some new wrinkles. So I think there is still the possibility of more rapid social change because of that end of work and that movement towards the golden age. I think even these small changes, though, even if it's happening at the periphery, this is going to create a lot more tension. And right now that tension is very much in the United States, but not just in the United States. If you look at Germany as well, you see these same tensions between the urban and the suburban, or the urban and the rural. And there are two Americas. People have talked about the two Americas for a long, long time, but those two Americas are dividing. And it's not necessarily left and right so much as it is urban and non-urban. And, if you look at the map, that does map to how people vote and that sort of thing. But I think that division is much more, it's not just about what you think about taxes and what you think about the social state. I think it's a much broader cultural divide that is going to continue to divide. And how you stitch that back together again, I do not know. I don't know what that looks like. And I think if you wanted to look for the problem that needs to be fixed, it is how to do that. It is how to bring these groups together and how to create new forms of trust between them and to find what's useful in both those approaches and find what unites those groups. So that's my very speculative and entirely from the gut feeling about the bigger picture. And you might say, well, who cares what you think? And you'd be right to say that. But as I said, at this point, I think anybody who tells you they know what things are going to look like in 40 years is lying to you. So I won't tell you that. I'll tell you very clearly that I have a decent feeling of what things are going to look like in 5 years, a very rough feeling of what they might like in 10 or 15, and no idea what you all are going to be left with in 40 years. Hope you enjoyed the course as a whole, and hope I get to see you in person at some point along the line. Thanks.